The desert twilight painted the Arizona sky in shades of blood and gold as Jack Remington rode through the rocky outskirts of Tombstone. The year was 1886, and the notorious mining town was slowly settling into an uneasy peace after years of violence. Jack preferred the solitude of the wilderness to the crowded saloons and dusty streets, where men's eyes followed him with suspicion and whispered questions about his past. "Hi, how are you?" Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story. At 43, Jack was a man carved by hardship. His weathered face bore the scars of countless fights, and his steel-gray eyes held secrets that would never see daylight. He rode alone by choice, trusting only his faithful horse, Thunder, a black stallion that had carried him through more dangers than he cared to remember. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack spotted something that made his blood freeze. There, collapsed against a cluster of prickly pear cacti, lay a woman. Her long black hair was matted with dried blood, and her traditional Apache dress was torn and stained crimson. She wasn't moving. Jack dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. Apache raids had been increasing in recent months, and finding a wounded Apache woman in the middle of nowhere could mean an ambush was waiting in the shadows. "Easy, Thunder," he whispered, scanning the surrounding rocks for any sign of movement. As he approached the woman, her eyes suddenly opened, dark as obsidian and filled with pain, but also with an intelligence that caught him off guard. She tried to speak, but only a weak whisper escaped her lips. "Please," she managed in broken English, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. Jack knelt beside her, his weathered hands checking her wounds. She had been shot twice, once in the shoulder and once in the side. The bleeding had slowed, but she was losing strength fast. "Name's Jack," he said softly, offering her water from his canteen. "What's your name?" "Naliné," she whispered, struggling to sit up. You must help. Take it easy. You're hurt bad." Naliné grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her eyes burning with desperation. "White men. They took her, little girl with yellow hair. They shot me when I tried to stop them." Jack's blood ran cold. A kidnapped child. In these parts, that usually meant one thing: human trafficking or worse. "What little girl? When did this happen?" 3 days ago, in Tombstone. Emily Parsons. Her father owns the bank. They took her from her bedroom window." Naliné's voice grew weaker with each word. I was watching the house, trying to protect her." "Why were you protecting a white child?" Naliné's eyes filled with tears. Because she is my daughter too." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. A half Apache child. In 1886, Arizona, such children lived in constant danger, caught between two worlds that often wanted nothing to do with them. "The men who took her," Jack pressed, "did you recognize them?" "One had a scar. Here," she touched her left cheek. "Called himself Morrison. They spoke of taking her to Mexico, selling her to—" Naliné's eyes rolled back and she collapsed unconscious. Jack checked her pulse, weak but steady. She was dying, and he was miles from the nearest doctor. Even if he could get her to Tombstone, most doctors there wouldn't treat an Apache woman. Jack looked at Thunder, then back at Naliné. What he was about to do went against every survival instinct he'd developed over decades of living on the edge. But looking at this wounded woman, this mother fighting to save her child, he saw something that reminded him of his own lost family, the wife and daughter he'd failed to protect years ago. "I'm sorry, old friend," he whispered to Thunder, lifting Naliné onto the horse's back. "But she needs you more than I do right now." Jack tied his water and food supplies to the saddle, then pointed Thunder toward the distant lights of Tombstone. With a sharp slap on the horse's flank, he sent his only means of survival galloping into the night, carrying the unconscious Apache woman toward whatever help she might find. As Thunder's hoofbeats faded into the darkness, Jack was left alone in the desert with nothing but his weapons, a half-empty canteen, and a growing certainty that he'd just made either the most noble or the most foolish decision of his life. The desert night was cold and unforgiving. Jack built a small fire and settled in to wait for dawn, knowing that come morning he'd have to start walking toward Tombstone, a journey that would take him at least 2 days on foot through Apache territory. As he stared into the flames, Jack couldn't shake Naliné's words. A kidnapped child, a mother's desperate love, and somewhere out there men who trafficked in human misery were getting farther away with every passing hour. Jack had spent years running from his past, from the memories of his own family's death, from the guilt that ate at him like acid. But maybe, just maybe, this was his chance for redemption. If he could save Emily Parsons, if he could reunite her with her mother, perhaps he could finally forgive himself for the family he'd failed to save. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the star-filled sky. Jack checked his weapons, his Colt .45, a Winchester rifle, and a knife his father had given him. Not much against the dangers that lay ahead, but it would have to be enough. As the night wore on, Jack found himself thinking about Naliné's story. How had an Apache woman come to have a half-white daughter? What was the connection to the banker, Parsons? And who was this Morrison character with the scarred face? The questions multiplied in his mind, but one thing was clear. Emily Parsons was in terrible danger, and time was running out. Jack had made his choice. Now he had to live with the consequences. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, Jack kicked dirt over his fire and prepared to start walking. He had no idea that his decision to save Naliné would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything he thought he knew about justice, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. The desert stretched endlessly before him, and somewhere in that vast wilderness, a little girl was counting on a stranger she'd never met to bring her home. Jack had been walking for 3 hours when he saw them. The morning sun was climbing higher, turning the desert into a furnace, when movement on the ridge ahead caught his eye. At first he thought it might be a mirage. The heat could play tricks on a man's mind. But as the figures became clearer, Jack's blood turned to ice. 70 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, silhouetted against the blazing sky like something out of a nightmare. They were arranged in a perfect line along the ridge, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. At their center rode a man who could only be their chief, tall, proud, with eagle feathers in his long black hair and war paint streaking his weathered face. Jack stopped walking and slowly raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. In the silence of the desert, he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. 70 against 1. There was no escape, no cover, nowhere to run. If they wanted him dead, he'd be dead before he could draw his gun. The chief raised his hand, and the entire war party began moving down the ridge with the fluid grace of predators. They surrounded Jack in a perfect circle, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust. The warriors' faces were masks of stone, revealing nothing of their intentions. The chief rode forward until he was close enough for Jack to see the intelligence burning in his dark eyes. When he spoke, his English was perfect, with only the slightest trace of an accent. "You are the white man who saved Naliné." It wasn't a question. Jack nodded slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Yes. Is she alive?" "She lives. Your horse brought her to our camp before dawn. She told us what you did." The chief studied Jack with the intensity of a hawk examining its prey. "I am Chief Dasoda-hae. Naliné is my daughter." Jack felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift. "Your daughter? Then Emily is my granddaughter." The chief's voice carried a weight of pain that surprised Jack. "The child of my daughter, and the white banker who promised to marry her, then cast her aside when his people discovered their relationship." The circle of warriors remained motionless, but Jack could feel their tension like electricity in the air. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and this conversation would end in blood. "The men who took Emily," Jack said carefully. "Your daughter said one was called Morrison." Chief Dasoda-hae's eyes flashed with fury. "Morrison! Yes, we know this name. He is a slave trader who operates between here and Mexico. He specializes in children. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach turn. How long ago did they take her? 4 days now. They have a head start, but we know where they are going. The chief paused, studying Jack's face. The question is, white man, what are you willing to do to help us get her back? Jack looked around at the 70 warriors surrounding him. Each one was armed with rifles, bows, and traditional weapons. They were some of the finest fighters in the world, men who could track a whisper across stone and strike like lightning from the shadows. What are you asking me? Chief Dasoda-hae dismounted and walked closer, his presence commanding even on foot. Morrison and his men are holed up in an old mining camp called Devil's Canyon, 2 days' ride south of here. It is a fortress built into the rocks, with only one way in or out. My warriors could take it, but not without great loss of life. And in the fighting, the child might be killed. Jack was beginning to understand. But a white man might be able to get close without raising suspicion. Exactly. Morrison knows that Apache warriors are hunting him. He will be watching for us. But a lone cowboy, perhaps looking for work or shelter. The chief let the implication hang in the air. You want me to infiltrate their camp. I want you to help me save my granddaughter. Chief Dasoda-hae's voice dropped to almost a whisper. In return, I offer you something no white man has ever received from my people, our protection, our friendship, and a share in the justice we will bring to those who harm children. Jack looked around at the warriors again. These men had every reason to hate him, to see him as just another white invader who'd brought nothing but death and broken promises to their people. But instead, they were offering him alliance. Why? Jack asked. Why trust me? Chief Dasoda-hae smiled for the first time, and it transformed his entire face. Because you gave up your horse, your life, to save my daughter. Because when you could have left her to die, you chose to help. And because Naliné told me something else about you. What? She said you have the eyes of a man who has lost children of his own. Jack felt the old wound tear open in his chest. His wife Sarah, his daughter Emma, dead these 8 years, killed by raiders while he was away on a cattle drive. He'd never forgiven himself for not being there to protect them. She's right, Jack said quietly. Then you understand what I am feeling. What any father feels when his child is in danger. Chief Dasoda-hae extended his hand. Will you help us, Jack Remington? Jack stared at the offered hand. Everything he'd been taught about Apache told him this was impossible. White men and Apache didn't work together. They were enemies, had always been enemies. But looking into Chief Dasoda-hae's eyes, Jack saw something that transcended race or culture, a father's love for his family. He clasped the chief's hand. I'll help you get Emily back. A murmur ran through the circle of warriors, but Jack couldn't tell if it was approval or disapproval. Chief Dasoda-hae nodded once, then turned to his men and spoke rapidly in Apache. Several warriors dismounted and began unpacking supplies. We will give you a horse, weapons, and provisions, the chief explained. But first, you must understand what you are walking into. Morrison is not just a slave trader. He is a killer who enjoys his work. His men are the worst kind of outlaws, wanted by law from here to California. They will not hesitate to kill you if they suspect anything. What about Emily? How do I know she's still alive? Chief Dasoda-hae's jaw tightened. Because Morrison sent word to her father 3 days ago. He wants ransom, $10,000 in gold, but even if Parsons pays, Morrison will not return the child. He will sell her in Mexico and keep the ransom money as well. Jack felt sick. Does Parsons know about the ransom demand? He knows. But he also knows that if he pays, he will never see his daughter again. That is why he has not responded. The chief's voice carried a note of grudging respect. Say what you will about Parsons, but he is not a fool. A warrior approached leading a paint horse, its coat a mixture of brown and white patches. Another handed Jack a rifle and ammunition, while a third offered a leather pouch containing food and water. The horse is called Windrunner, Chief Dasoda-hae said. He is fast and sure-footed. He will carry you to Devil's Canyon by tomorrow evening. Jack swung into the saddle, feeling the horse's strength beneath him. "What's the plan once I get there?" "Get inside their camp. Learn their defenses, their numbers, where they are keeping Emily. Then signal us." The chief handed Jack a small mirror. "3 flashes of sunlight from the canyon rim at sunset. We will be watching." "And then?" Chief Dasoda-hae's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then we will show Morrison and his men what happens to those who steal Apache children." As Jack prepared to ride out, one of the younger warriors called out something in Apache. Chief Dasoda-hae translated. "He says to be careful, that Morrison is known for his cruelty to children." Jack's hands tightened on the reins. "Tell him I understand, and tell him that Morrison's cruelty ends tomorrow." With that, Jack spurred Windrunner into a gallop, heading south toward Devil's Canyon and whatever fate awaited him there. Behind him, 70 Apache warriors watched him go, their lives and the life of a little girl now resting in the hands of a lonely cowboy who'd already lost everything once before. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks of Devil's Canyon when Jack first saw the mining camp. It was exactly as Chief Dasoda-hae had described, a fortress carved into the living rock, with wooden buildings clustered around the mouth of an old silver mine. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Jack could see armed men patrolling the perimeter. Jack had spent the day carefully crafting his story. He was a drifter looking for work, down on his luck and willing to do anything for a meal and a place to sleep. It was close enough to the truth to be believable. As he rode Windrunner down the narrow trail into the canyon, Jack counted at least a dozen men visible around the camp. All were heavily armed, and all looked like the kind of hard cases who'd shoot first and ask questions later. This was going to be even more dangerous than he'd thought. "Hold it right there, stranger," the voice came from above. Jack looked up to see a rifle barrel pointed at him from behind a pile of rocks. He raised his hands slowly, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. "Easy there, friend," Jack called out. "Just looking for work and a hot meal." A man emerged from behind the rocks, tall, lean, with a face like a hatchet and cold blue eyes. He kept his rifle trained on Jack as he approached. "Name's Briggs," the man said. "What kind of work you looking for?" "Any kind that pays. Been riding the grub line for weeks now. Heard there might be opportunities down this way." Briggs studied him for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the camp. "Come on down. Boss'll want to talk to you." As they descended into the canyon, Jack got a better look at the setup. The buildings were arranged in a rough semicircle around the mine entrance, with clear fields of fire in all directions. Anyone trying to attack this place would be walking into a death trap. "That's the bunkhouse." Briggs pointed to a long, low building. "Mess hall's next to it. Boss lives in the big cabin up there." Jack followed Briggs's gaze to a substantial log cabin built on a ledge overlooking the camp. Even from a distance, he could see it was well fortified, with gun ports cut into the walls. "What kind of operation you boys running here?" Jack asked, trying to sound casual. Briggs gave him a sharp look. "The kind where smart men don't ask too many questions." They reached the center of the camp, where several men were gathered around a fire. Jack's blood ran cold when he saw their leader, a big man with graying hair and a vicious scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Morrison. "What have we got here, Briggs?" Morrison's voice was like gravel in a bucket. "Drifter looking for work, boss. Says his name's—" Briggs looked at Jack expectantly. "Jake," Jack said, using the alias he'd chosen. "Jake Thompson." Morrison stood up, and Jack was struck by the man's sheer physical presence. He was at least 6'4" and built like a bull, with hands that looked like they could crush a man's skull. But it was his eyes that were truly frightening, pale green and completely without warmth or mercy. "Jake Thompson," Morrison repeated, circling Jack like a predator. "Where you from, Jake?" "Originally from Texas. Been working cattle drives mostly, but the work's drying up." "That's so." Morrison stopped directly in front of Jack, close enough that Jack could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You ever do any special work? The kind that requires discretion?" Jack met Morrison's stare without flinching. "Depends on the pay." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I like you already, Jake. Tell me, how do you feel about Apache?" "Same as any sensible man." They're dangerous, but they can be dealt with if you know what you're doing. Good answer. Morrison clapped Jack on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him. See, we've got ourselves a little Apache problem. Seems they're looking for something that belongs to us. Jack's heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. What kind of something? The kind that's worth a lot of money to the right buyer. Morrison's scarred face twisted into a grin. But don't you worry about that. Right now, I just need men who can shoot straight and follow orders. You interested? Like I said, depends on the pay. $20 a week, plus food and shelter. And if our current business venture pays off, there'll be a bonus for everyone. $20 a week was good money. More than most cowboys made in a month. Whatever Morrison was planning, it was big. Sounds fair, Jack said. When do I start? Right now. Briggs, get Jake here settled in the bunkhouse. Tomorrow we'll see what he's made of. As Briggs led him away, Jack caught a glimpse of movement in the window of Morrison's cabin. For just a moment, he saw a small face pressed against the glass. A little girl with blonde hair and frightened eyes. Emily. Jack's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to keep walking. She was alive, and that was what mattered. Now he had to figure out how to get her out of there. The bunkhouse was a rough affair. 24 beds crammed into a space meant for half that many. Most were occupied by men who looked like they'd crawled out from under rocks. Jack claimed an empty bunk near the back and tried to blend in. So what's the real story here? Jack asked the man in the next bunk, a grizzled prospector named Pete. Pete looked around nervously before answering. Morrison's got himself a little side business, kidnapping mostly. Rich folks' kids. This latest one's supposed to be worth a fortune. Apache giving him trouble? Hell yes. Word is they got 70 warriors out there just waiting for a chance to hit us. Morrison's getting nervous, talking about moving the operation south to Mexico. Jack's blood chilled. If Morrison decided to move Emily to Mexico, she'd disappear forever into the slave markets of Central America. When's he planning to move? Soon as he gets word from the kid's father. Sent a ransom demand 3 days ago. If the old man doesn't pay up by tomorrow night, Morrison's cutting his losses and heading for the border. Tomorrow night. Jack had less than 24 hours to signal Chief Dasoda-hae and get Emily out of there. As the other men settled in for the night, Jack lay on his bunk and studied the layout of the camp through the bunkhouse windows. Morrison's cabin was about 50 yards away, built on a ledge that would be almost impossible to reach without being seen. But if Emily was being held there, that's where he had to go. Around midnight, when the camp had grown quiet except for the snoring of the outlaws, Jack slipped out of his bunk and made his way to the door. The guard rotation had changed an hour ago, and he'd counted the timing. He had maybe 10 minutes before the next patrol came around. Moving like a shadow, Jack crept across the camp toward Morrison's cabin. The moon was dark, which helped, but it also made the terrain treacherous. One misplaced step could send rocks tumbling and alert the guards. He was halfway to the cabin when he heard it. A child's voice, muffled but unmistakable, coming from a small building he'd taken for a storage shed. Jack changed direction, moving toward the sound. The building had no windows, but there was a gap between two of the boards wide enough for Jack to peer through. What he saw made his blood boil. Emily Parsons sat huddled in the corner of the tiny room, her blonde hair dirty and tangled, her dress torn. She was maybe 7 years old, and her blue eyes were wide with terror. But she was alive, and she was unharmed. Emily, Jack whispered through the gap. The little girl's head snapped up, and she scrambled toward the wall. Who's there? My name's Jack. I'm a friend of your mother's. I'm here to help you. My mother? Emily's voice was filled with hope and confusion. But my mother is dead. Jack's heart clenched. Of course, Emily didn't know about Naliné. As far as she knew, her only parent was her father. I mean, your father sent me, Jack corrected quickly. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to be very brave. Can you do that? Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. I want to go home. You will. Tomorrow night, I promise. But until then, you have to pretend you don't know me. Can you do that? Yes. Good girl. I'll be back for you, Emily, I promise. Jack slipped back to the bunkhouse, his mind racing. He'd found Emily, confirmed she was alive and relatively unharmed. Now he had to figure out how to signal Chief Dasoda-hae and coordinate a rescue that wouldn't get the little girl killed in the crossfire. As he lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, Jack thought about the promise he'd just made to a terrified little girl. He'd failed to save his own daughter 8 years ago, but Emily Parsons was going home, even if it cost him his life. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the sound of Morrison's voice bellowing orders across the camp. Jack rolled out of his bunk with the other men, his mind focused on the signal he needed to send to Chief Dasoda-hae. 3 flashes of sunlight from the canyon rim at sunset. That was the plan. But first, he had to survive the day without arousing suspicion. "Thompson!" Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. "Get over here!" Jack jogged over to where Morrison stood with Briggs and 2 other men Jack didn't recognize. Up close, the scar on Morrison's face was even more hideous, a twisted line of white tissue that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. "We got a problem," Morrison said without preamble. "Apache scouts were spotted on the North Ridge last night. They're getting closer." Jack's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "How many?" "Just scouts so far, but where there's scouts, there's warriors. I want you and Briggs to take a ride up to the rim, see what you can see." This was perfect. Jack would have a legitimate reason to be on the canyon rim with the mirror. "Yes, sir." "And Thompson?" Morrison's pale green eyes bored into Jack's. "If you see any Apache, you shoot first and count bodies later. Understood?" Understood. An hour later, Jack and Briggs were climbing the narrow trail that led to the canyon rim. Briggs was a talker, which suited Jack fine. It meant he didn't have to work hard to maintain his cover. "Been with Morrison long?" Jack asked as they rode. 3 years. Best money I ever made." Briggs spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Morrison's got connections all over the territory. Knows which kids are worth taking, which families will pay." Jack's stomach turned. "How many kids has he taken?" "Dozen or so. Most get sold down in Mexico. Rich folks down there pay good money for blonde children." Briggs glanced at Jack. "Don't go getting soft on me, Thompson. It's just business." Just business. Jack had to bite his tongue to keep from putting a bullet in Briggs right then and there. They reached the rim just as the sun was approaching its zenith. The view was spectacular, miles of desert stretching in every direction, broken by mesas and arroyos. And somewhere out there, 70 Apache warriors were waiting for his signal. "Don't see nothing," Briggs said, scanning the horizon with his spyglass. "Maybe them scouts moved on." Jack pulled out his own field glasses and pretended to search the landscape. What he was really doing was looking for any sign of Chief Dasoda-hae's men. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, just for an instant, sunlight flashed off something metallic about 2 miles to the north. They were there, waiting. "I'll take the east side," Jack said, moving away from Briggs. "Cover more ground that way." "Good thinking." Jack positioned himself behind a boulder where Briggs couldn't see him clearly, then pulled out the mirror Chief Dasoda-hae had given him. The sun was in perfect position. Jack angled the mirror and sent 3 quick flashes toward the North Ridge. Almost immediately, he saw an answering flash. Message received. "See anything over there?" Briggs called out. "Nothing yet," Jack replied, slipping the mirror back into his pocket. "But we should keep watching." They spent another hour on the rim before heading back to camp. Jack's mind was racing, trying to figure out how the rescue would work. Chief Dasoda-hae had said they would attack after receiving the signal. But when? And how could Jack make sure Emily wasn't caught in the crossfire? As they rode back into camp, Jack noticed increased activity around Morrison's cabin. Men were loading supplies onto pack horses, and Morrison himself was supervising the operation with obvious urgency. "What's going on?" Jack asked Pete as they unsaddled their horses. "Word came in while you were gone. The kid's father ain't paying the ransom. Morrison's cutting his losses, heading for Mexico tonight." Tonight. Jack's blood turned to ice. If Morrison left with Emily before Chief Dasoda-hae could attack, she'd be lost forever. "When tonight?" "Soon as it gets dark." "Morrison don't like traveling these roads in daylight. Too many patrols." Jack had to think fast. The Apache attack would come, but it might be too late. He had to find a way to delay Morrison's departure, or better yet, get Emily away from the main group before they left. As evening approached, Jack volunteered for guard duty, positioning himself where he could watch both Morrison's cabin and the small building where Emily was being held. The camp was a hive of activity as the outlaws prepared for their journey south. Just after sunset, Jack saw Morrison emerge from his cabin carrying a small bundle. Even from a distance, Jack could see it was Emily, wrapped in a blanket. She appeared to be unconscious, probably drugged to keep her quiet during the journey. Morrison carried Emily to a wagon that had been prepared for the trip, placing her in the back and covering her with canvas. Jack's hands itched for his gun, but he was outnumbered 20-1. He had to wait for the Apache attack. But as the minutes ticked by and Morrison's men finished their preparations, Jack began to realize that the attack might not come in time. Morrison was ready to leave, and once that wagon rolled out of the canyon, Emily would disappear forever. That's when Jack made a decision that would change everything. He slipped away from his guard post and made his way to the wagon. Most of Morrison's men were busy with final preparations, and in the confusion, no one noticed one more figure moving through the shadows. Jack was just reaching for the canvas covering Emily when a voice stopped him cold. "I was wondering when you'd make your move." Jack spun around to find Morrison standing behind him, a Colt .45 pointed at his chest. The outlaw's scarred face was twisted in a cruel smile. "You really thought I didn't know who you were?" Morrison laughed. "Jack Remington, the famous gunfighter, the man who lost his own family to Apache raiders 8 years ago." Jack's blood turned to ice. How did I know?" "Because I was there, Jack. I was part of the gang that hit your ranch." Morrison's smile widened. "I'm the one who killed your wife and daughter." The world seemed to stop. Jack stared at Morrison, his mind reeling. The man who had destroyed his life, who had murdered his family, was standing right in front of him. "That's right," Morrison continued, enjoying Jack's shock. "Sarah and little Emma. They begged for their lives, just like all the others. But business is business, right?" Rage exploded through Jack like wildfire. His hand moved toward his gun, but Morrison was ready. "I wouldn't," Morrison warned. "Not if you want the little girl to live." Jack froze, his hand inches from his weapon. "That's better. You see, Jack, I've been planning this for a long time. When I heard you were in the territory, I knew you'd eventually come looking for me. So I arranged a little incentive to draw you out. You took Emily to get to me? Partly, but mostly because she's worth a fortune in Mexico. The fact that it would hurt you was just a bonus." Morrison's eyes glittered with malice. "You cost me a lot of money 8 years ago, Jack. Killed 3 of my best men when you came after us. I've been looking forward to returning the favor. Let the girl go." "Your fight is with me." "Oh, I intend to finish our fight. But first, I want you to watch me take another child away from someone who loves her, just like I did to you." Morrison raised his gun, and Jack knew he was about to die. But before Morrison could pull the trigger, the night exploded with the sound of war cries and gunfire. Chief Dasoda-hae's warriors poured into the canyon like a flood, their rifles blazing. Morrison's men, caught completely off guard, scattered in panic. In the chaos, Morrison's attention wavered for just a moment. It was all Jack needed. He drew and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet taking Morrison in the chest. The outlaw staggered backward, his own shot going wide, then collapsed to the ground. Jack rushed to the wagon and pulled away the canvas covering Emily. The little girl was awake now, her eyes wide with terror at the sound of battle raging around them. "It's okay," Jack said, lifting her from the wagon. "I'm going to get you out of here." As he carried Emily toward the edge of the camp, Jack saw Chief Dasoda-hae riding through the chaos, his warriors systematically eliminating Morrison's men. The battle was already over. It had been a slaughter. Chief Dasoda-hae rode up to Jack, his face grim but satisfied. "Is she hurt?" "She's fine," Jack said, setting Emily down gently. "Just scared." The little girl looked up at the Apache chief with wide eyes. "Are you going to hurt me?" Chief Dasoda-hae dismounted and knelt before Emily, his weathered face softening. "No, little one. I am your grandfather. I have come to take you home." "My grandfather?" Emily looked confused. "But I don't have a grandfather." You have two grandmothers and two grandfathers, Chief Dasoda-hae said gently. One white family and one Apache family. Both love you very much. As the truth began to dawn on Emily's young face, Jack felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Morrison was dead. Emily was safe. And for the first time in 8 years, Jack felt like he might finally be able to forgive himself for the family he'd failed to save. The lonely cowboy had found his redemption in the most unlikely place. In the love of an Apache grandfather for his mixed-blood granddaughter, and in the courage to do what was right, no matter the cost. As they prepared to leave Devil's Canyon, Chief Dasoda-hae placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. You will always be welcome among my people, Jack Remington. You have proven that the color of a man's skin matters less than the courage in his heart. Jack looked down at Emily, who was now holding her grandfather's hand with complete trust. What happens now? Now, Chief Dasoda-hae smiled, we take this little girl home to both her families. And we teach the world that love is stronger than hatred, that family is more than blood, and that sometimes the most unlikely alliances can change everything. As they rode out of the canyon under a canopy of stars, Jack realized that he was no longer the lonely cowboy he'd been when this adventure began. He'd found something he thought he'd lost forever: a family, a purpose, and the knowledge that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.